Hey everyone, welcome to Prince Asbel. It turns out that I need to preempt this response to Anita Sarkeesian's Ordinary Women episode on Murasaki with a bit of retraction. Back in April, I had responded to the few remarks she'd made about Murasaki in her fundraiser video for her Ordinary Women series. This was in my Anita and Laura versus the Facts of History video. It turns out I made multiple errors in the Murasaki segment of that video, and we're going to clean those up today. I've left an annotation in that video, so if you haven't seen that particular part of the video, that segment on Murasaki, don't watch it. I know a lot of people have already seen it, but I'm going to make up for that today. But before I do that, we're going to look at the production of this episode like we did last time. This episode is only 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. You thought the Emma Goldman episode was short? This one is 2 minutes shorter than that. At a cost of approximately $29,000, this episode is brought to you at the low price of $131.82 per second. That's almost $50 more expensive per second than the Emma Goldman episode. And if you did what we did last time, i.e. divide the $25,000 Anita asked for to create this episode's animation by the number of seconds of animation that are actually in the episode, then the animation alone cost $159.24 per second. Wow. Well, is the animation gorgeous like Anita said it would be? Oh, well, look at that. That's not bad. It's actually kind of pretty. I still wouldn't call it gorgeous like Anita promised, and it sure as heck isn't worth $25,000. It looks like they spent maybe 50 hours at most making this animation. What, were they paying Noodle House $500 an hour for this? They couldn't find anybody. They just couldn't find anybody at all who would do the same work for a tenth of the price? This animation might be better, but come on. It's still way too freaking expensive. Oh, and as I've discovered since making my first rebuttal episode of Ordinary Women, this place where they shot these videos, it's a YouTube space in LA. A place where you can use the sets, the cameras, the sound equipment, etc. for free. No charge or anything. All you have to do is have at least 10,000 subscribers and meet certain guidelines. So they didn't have to spend a penny of that $20,000 in pre-production money on any of the stuff you see in this behind-the-scenes footage. Sure makes me wonder where that $20,000 Anita said she'd spent on pre-production went, especially since they shot all these videos in one day in one single 12-hour shift. This episode was a beast to dissect. Some of the errors, while problematic, are not necessarily due to deliberate dishonesty on Laura Hudson or Anita Sarkeesian's part. There are still points from my Facts of History video that go unanswered, and we'll begin with one of those. Anita said Murasaki lived in a time and place where women's names were rarely recorded.
Her name was Murasaki Shikibu, or at least that's the only name we can give her now. Born into an aristocratic Japanese family sometime in the 970s, she lived at a time when the names of women were rarely recorded.
Anita said the same thing in her fundraiser video for this series.
Murasaki Shikibu lived at a time when women's names were rarely even written down.
This is a good example of the problems we'll have throughout this video. It's not that this statement isn't true, but isn't it also true that men's names were rarely written down? Is this question deliberately leaving out half of the story, or is it an innocent mistake on Anita and Laura's part? As Professor Richard Bowring wrote in his book about the tale of Genji, he said that Murasaki's novel has almost nothing resembling what we might consider personal names for its characters, both men and women alike. And he says it's the Japanese women of that time that are responsible for writing a great deal of their own history. Other authors have made similar statements like this. It might very well be that it's the very women who recorded Japanese history who are responsible for not writing down women's names. In other words, it wasn't some misogynistic plot by evil men. It might just be that even women didn't write women's names down because they didn't really have a problem with it. However, it's at this point we begin to see how complicated it can be to scrutinize this subject. I have page 45 of the Literary 100, a ranking of the most influential novelists, playwrights, and poets of all time. It says women during the period had no public function, and their names were rarely recorded.
She lived at a time when the names of women were rarely recorded.
So it's not like Anita Sarkeesian or Laura Hudson are deliberately misrepresenting the facts. There are published written works that have said what they're saying now, and since they're almost certainly taking their cues from them because they have to, because they obviously don't know ancient Chinese or Japanese, I can't really call them liars. But they don't seem aware that Murasaki herself didn't give names to almost anybody at all, male or female, in her own novel. I don't know about you, but that kind of information would give me pause. In fact, Richard Bowring even makes the point that male writers writings in Sino-Japanese included things like names and dates and other things, whereas by contrast, the Kagero Diary, which was written by a woman, had few names or dates in it. What's up with that? I thought women's names weren't written down, and that proves that there was some literary misogyny in the Heian period of Japan. Anita Sarkeesian and Laura Hudson may technically be correct that women's names were rarely written down, but it's far from settled for me that that's because of misogyny.
The granddaughter of a famous poet and the daughter of a scholar, Murasaki became conversant in Japanese and Chinese literature so quickly she was considered something of a literary prodigy. In her diary, Murasaki recorded her father's reactions when he realized exactly how talented she was. He said, "Just my luck. What a pity she was not born a man."
Yep, that's true too. But what Anita didn't mention is the background of that statement. Murasaki learned Chinese by sitting in on her brother's lessons in which he was being taught Chinese. Now, Laura Hudson, who I'll remind you is the scriptwriter for this series, she did mention that fact in Feminist Frequency's behind the scenes video on Murasaki.
And she went out and learned it anyway, and learned it much faster than her brother, whose lessons she was eavesdropping on.
But neither of them mentioned that the reason her brother was being taught Chinese was because women weren't allowed to work in government service. Murasaki's brother was being trained for government service and he needed to know Chinese. Murasaki didn't need to know Chinese, but she learned it anyway and did better than her brother. That's why her father said what he did. He didn't simply bemoan the fact that he had a smart daughter. And by the way, remember what Anita Sarkeesian said back in March?
Each of them was surrounded by cultural messages that said women had to be small, quiet, and submissive in order to be good. In a world that was designed to silence and diminish them, they had to be more than just talented. They had to be defiant.
She lived in a world that was designed to silence and diminish women, even though her own supposedly misogynistic father allowed her to learn to read and write in 2 different languages? Surely he would be the first one to silence and diminish her if that were true. But you know what? We're gonna try and hold off on that for a few moments and come back to it again a little bit later. Let's move on to another claim Anita made.
The tale of Genji earned Murasaki a permanent place in literary history. It may also have helped her secure a position at the imperial court, where she became an attendant and occasional tutor to the Empress Shoshi.
I'd previously argued that this couldn't be possible, but it turns out this statement is true. In my Anita and Laura versus the Facts of History video and my Anita's Ordinary Women Campaign Examined video, I latched onto a quote from the book True Lies Worldwide. It says on page 54 that the Empress told Murasaki to write the tale of Genji, and I argued that that proved that Murasaki didn't need to be defiant to accomplish what she did. However, this paragraph is actually describing the legend surrounding Murasaki's inspiration for the tale of Genji. It's a legend, not a precise historical statement of fact. And I'd also overlooked the other things that came right before it on the same page. The authors talk about Murasaki writing her book and coming to the court, but they use phrases like, "It is generally assumed Murasaki started writing around the year 1001. She seems to have been well known around 1006. The tale of Genji was probably a work in progress around that time." They're careful to make qualifiers that signify the possibility that these dates are not necessarily accurate. Likewise, Laura Hudson wrote, and Anita said, that the tale of Genji may have been the reason Murasaki was asked to serve the Empress.
It may also have helped her secure a position at the imperial court, where she became an attendant and occasional tutor to the Empress Shoshi.
As far as I'm concerned, she's right. She didn't even go as far as one history book did, The Human Record, when they bold-faced declared that the masterpiece that earned Murasaki? Looks like we have a bit of a typing error here, but they definitively say it was the tale of Genji that earned Murasaki her post at the imperial court. As far as I can tell, they don't know that, but the point is, Laura Hudson seems to have even been more careful than this history book. In fact, I was the one who was wrong to definitively declare that Murasaki wrote the tale of Genji because the Empress told her to do so. That might be true, but I don't know that, and I wish I'd been more careful. But, all that being said, we still got a bit of a problem.
Each of them was surrounded by cultural messages that said women had to be small, quiet, and submissive in order to be good. In a world that was designed to silence and diminish them, they had to be more than just talented. They had to be defiant.
I said we'd come back to this, didn't I? If it is true that the tale of Genji earned Murasaki her job at the court, then that means her unfinished novel was well known. It was popular. It got her a job serving an empress. If that's a possibility, then how on earth could Anita state so confidently that the world, she said it, the world was designed to silence and diminish her? Why was she rewarded with a job serving royalty as opposed to being thrown in prison? Just in granting that possibility, Anita and Laura have contradicted themselves. They don't seem to realize that information like this completely undermines their defiant women of history theme.
Murasaki became quite close with the Empress and even secretly taught her Chinese, a language only men were supposed to learn.
Alright, this statement was a beast to untangle. I mean, this whole episode is a beast, but this one sentence is like the belly of the beast. This is perhaps the only legitimate defiant moment of Murasaki that Anita talks about, and we're going to go through it with a fine-tooth comb. I remember Laura Hudson making a similar statement in her behind-the-scenes video about Murasaki.
You know, she was told that women didn't learn Chinese because that was the language of power and of politics and, you know, not the language of women.
I have to start off this section with a bit of chagrin. I had previously argued that Anita and Laura were just repeating what Richard Bowring had said in his book on this topic. But other authors say the same thing he did, so she wasn't necessarily being lazy or anything like that. And that's just the first part I have to humbly retract. I also argued that there is a possible stigma against Japanese people in general learning classical Chinese, because of a quote from Murasaki in Richard Bowring's book. Murasaki wrote that people around her had said that it's bad enough for a man to flaunt his Chinese learning, and she would come to no good. I'd taken that to mean there was a possible stigma against men learning Chinese as well, and therefore Anita and Laura were possibly lying when they said Chinese was not the language of women. Well, I was wrong about that. The fuller context of this quote shows that Murasaki was talking about another lady of the court who was spreading rumors about her, saying she was being proud and arrogant by flaunting her knowledge of Chinese. Nobody likes a show-off, and since women didn't even need to learn Chinese since they weren't going to be working for the government, that's probably what made it more audacious for a woman to show off. So I was wrong, and this quote does not undermine what Anita or Laura said. But, you know what does? The very passage where Murasaki wrote about secretly teaching the Empress Chinese. She says, "To keep it secret, we carefully chose times when the other women would not be present. And from the summer before last, I started giving her informal lessons on the 2 volumes of New Ballads. I hid this fact from others, as did Her Majesty, but somehow both His Excellency and His Majesty got wind of it, and they had some beautiful copies made of various Chinese books, which His Excellency then presented to her." What? The very king and prime minister of Japan found out and they didn't have them flogged? I thought Chinese was a language only men were supposed to learn.
Murasaki became quite close with the Empress and even secretly taught her Chinese, a language only men were supposed to learn.
You know, she was told that women didn't learn Chinese because that was the language of power and of politics and, you know, not the language of women.
In a world that was designed to silence and diminish them, they had to be more than just talented. They had to be defiant.
Defiant to freaking who? Murasaki didn't need to defy her father, or the prime minister, or even the king of Japan. The 2 top dogs of the country rewarded the Empress with beautiful copies of Chinese books. Who the heck was she defying? Where is this world that was designed to silence and diminish Murasaki? We could end here, but we are not going to, because this information does not necessarily prove that Anita Sarkeesian and Laura Hudson are lying. I know it seems like we caught them red-handed lying by omission, but just like I expect other people to think I made innocent mistakes before, we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt here. Consider the fact that the Empress wanted to learn Chinese in secret. There's obviously some reason for that. Anita and Laura presume it's misogyny. We don't know that, obviously, but that's one example of something that may lead a reader to think that. We also have another quote from Murasaki's diary that reads, "The other is full of Chinese books that have lain unattended ever since he who carefully collected them passed away. Whenever my loneliness threatens to overwhelm me, I take out 1 or 2 of them to look at, but my women gather together behind my back. It's because she goes on like this that she is so miserable. What kind of lady is it who reads Chinese books?" they whisper. "In the past, it was not even the done thing to read sutras." Yes, I feel like replying, but I've never met anyone who lived longer just because they believed in superstitions. But that would be thoughtless of me. There is some truth in what they say. That's the closest thing I could find that might back up what Anita and Laura have said. However, even in that quote, Murasaki treats reading Chinese like something someone might choose to do out of boredom. And notice she didn't say that the men chided her for this, it was the women. And it just so happens that it was a woman Murasaki was afraid of if she learned that Murasaki was teaching Chinese to the Empress. We have contradictions to what Anita Sarkeesian has said even in the writings that seem to prove what she claimed. Now, it is true that there are other sources that back up what Anita and Laura have said. The AncientScripts.com site says women weren't allowed to learn Chinese characters. The Japanese Women Writers book says it was unbecoming for women to know Chinese, the so-called masculine language. Even Richard Bowring, the man we looked at before, wrote that classical Chinese remained a male preserve, that most women weren't taught it, and even going so far as to say they manufactured a fictional stigma that said it was unbecoming for women to learn Chinese, because women learning Chinese was considered a threat to their exclusion from participating in the power structure. So Anita and Laura aren't necessarily lying when they say that Murasaki was told that Chinese was not the language of women. In fact, they are probably not intentionally trying to deceive anybody about this. However, they are still probably wrong, even if their intent was not to deceive. Professor Gerald Fiegel of Vanderbilt University said in Chapter 3 of his Topics in Japanese Cultural History online textbook that some women also learned classical Chinese, but they were under no social pressure to do so. Oh, really? I thought Murasaki was told Chinese was not the language of women.
You know, she was told that women didn't learn Chinese because that was the language of power and of politics and, not the language of women.
I thought Anita told us Chinese was a language only men were supposed to learn.
Murasaki became quite close with the Empress and even secretly taught her Chinese, a language only men were supposed to learn.
I thought that Ancient Scripts website told us that women were forbidden from learning Chinese characters. We also have page 54 of True Lies Worldwide, Fictionality in Global Contexts. We looked at this earlier, and it says the same thing Professor Fiegel did, namely that there were educated women besides Murasaki that had a good command of Chinese. Since all this information is readily available, why do some authors say what they do about Japanese men oppressing women by excluding them from learning Chinese? And why do some sources say the opposite? It's obvious that the history here is extremely complicated, but I think it can be cleared up for us by reading some selective excerpts from the book titled Rhetoric and the Discourses of Power in Court Culture, China, Europe, and Japan. I love this book. At least I love Chapter 8. The author is knowledgeable with Richard Bowring's and other authors' opinions that women were forbidden to learn Chinese because of oppression, and attempts to explain the whys and the hows and the overall reason for this entire mess. So, starting with page Roman numeral 12, we read, although the use of Chinese was a practical necessity in diplomacy, for example, even there, the aesthetic component of writing was highly valued. The key beneficiaries of this imperial patronage were men from the middle and lower rungs of the court aristocracy, but a few women were also part of Japan's Chinese language literary scene. The chapter focuses on the 8th and 9th centuries when Japanese enthusiasm for Chinese culture was at a peak, and briefly considers the classical age of Japanese literature that followed in order to address the presumed division of literary labor between men who wrote in Chinese and women who wrote in Japanese. Some have argued that women were expected to remain ignorant of Chinese, but the evidence is ambiguous, and some women clearly were literate in both languages. Page 201. The Chinese language is often given as the explanation for the prominence of women writers in early Japan. For example, in 1931, the historian George Sansom explained that, quote, the wits of the men were fuddled with Chinese books and secondhand Chinese ideas. The women, on the other hand, particularly in aristocratic circles, held a position where they were neither subordinate nor repressed nor weighed down by sterile learning, unquote. Ivan Morris reiterated this view in The World of the Shining Prince, Court Life in Ancient Japan, written in 1964, but still the first book, and most likely the last one too, that readers in the English-speaking world turn when they want to learn more about the Heian period. More recent scholarship is less accepting of the idea that women enjoyed relatively high status. For example, Richard Bowring, a distinguished contemporary authority on Japanese literature, has argued, quote, as one might expect, written Chinese was jealously guarded and from its inception became the exclusive domain of the male. Women were not taught Chinese and were thereby effectively excluded from participation in the power structure, and in order to perpetuate the state of affairs, the useful fiction was generated that it was unbecoming for the female to learn Chinese. There can be no doubt that the acquisition of Chinese by women was seen as a threat, a subversive act of considerable if undefined moment. Unquote. Thus, Bowring, like his predecessors, presents a negative assessment of Chinese, albeit for very different reasons. Chinese, which earlier writers treated as having oppressed the creativity of men, has now become an instrument for the political oppression of women. In other words, depending on one's point of view, the use of classical Chinese in Heian Japan can be seen as having oppressed both men and women. Page 226. What of the women? Were they forbidden to learn Chinese? Not in the opinion of Japanese scholars, although they acknowledge that the evidence is thin. In his monumental study, first published in 1963, in which he investigates how Chinese texts were actually read during the Heian period, Tsukishima Hiroshi includes a section on whether women knew Chinese. To support his argument that educated women could at least read Chinese, he reviews the extant data, which come to a mere 6 pages in a book well over 1,000 pages in length. In other words, judgments regarding women's knowledge of Chinese should be stated with some caution, since there is little documentation. Page 227. The evidence is slight, but then so is the evidence that women did not know Chinese. A key source, Murasaki's diary, also tells us that some women did read Chinese. After noting that she picked up Chinese more easily than did her brother, she says, "Father, a most learned man, was always regretting the fact. Just my luck, he would say. What a pity she was not born a man." But then I gradually realized that people were saying, it's bad enough when a man flaunts his Chinese learning. She will come to no good. And since then I have avoided writing the simplest character. Page 228. The passage confirms what Murasaki seems to have stated. Chinese was not included among feminine accomplishments, which were presumably calligraphy, waka, music, and so forth, but it was something parents might consider teaching their daughters anyhow. There is no suggestion that any taboos were being broken. Murasaki's comments clearly tell us that it was unladylike to flaunt one's knowledge of Chinese, and that a command of Chinese was more important for men than for women. Whether we can go beyond that is less certain. Murasaki also tells us that men too were expected to avoid displaying excessive erudition. Let's scroll down a bit here. If writing in Chinese was considered somehow masculine, it was not totally shunned by women, and conversely, women had no monopoly on writing in Japanese. Gender distinctions in literature were not so clear as some have suggested. And last but not least, page 229. Certainly, men were more likely to receive the training needed to become proficient in reading and especially writing Chinese, but the divide between men's and women's literary worlds was not so great as some have suggested. At least, some women participated in the nominally masculine world of Chinese learning. Heian women may not have enjoyed the high status attributed to them by some optimistic writers, but if they were oppressed, it was not by the Chinese language. Reading these quotes is so rewarding. Anita and Laura say Chinese was only for men. They don't know that. They said it was the language of power and politics, which is true, but they say it was not the language of women. They don't know that either. I love it when I research, when I scrutinize what feminists have to say, and I get rewarded like this. Now, don't get me wrong here, I didn't read all that to argue that Anita Sarkeesian and Laura Hudson are trying to intentionally deceive their audience into believing that women were barred from reading Chinese because of misogyny. Like I said before, I don't think they were. I think they possibly were innocently duped into making a definitive statement that they really don't know is true. But this brings up the final question. Why is it that it's still a big deal for Anita Sarkeesian to make mistakes, even the seemingly innocent ones? I made mistakes, she did, so what's the big deal? It's because she was paid $200,000. And
my analysis is very well researched. It's double and triple checked. It has to be, given the intense level of scrutiny focused on my every word.
This book that I found, it cost me less than $5 with shipping. If I can do better research and make more informed claims than she can, and I wasn't paid squat, what does that mean when an entire brigade of women with a $200,000 budget still can't make the cut?
My analysis is very well researched. It's double and triple checked. It has to be, given the intense level of scrutiny focused on my every word.
Oh my god. As Thunderfoot put it so eloquently,
I think we're going to have a fundamental disagreement about what constitutes well-researched here, Anita.
And with that, I conclude my rebuttal to episode 2 of Ordinary Women. I want to shout out a big thank you for watching, and especially to everyone who waited so patiently for me to make this video. Also, a big thank you to 3,000 subscribers and counting. If you think it was worth the wait, click the like button and the subscribe button, and if you didn't like it, click unlike and then subscribe. Thanks for watching. I am Prince Asbel, and wait, one more thing. Oh, it's so close to being done, but I've got one more thing I want to point out because I'm a nitpick. Anita said,
Each of them was surrounded by cultural messages that said women had to be small, quiet, and submissive in order to be good. But they spoke up for themselves. In a world that was designed to silence and diminish them, they had to be more than just talented. They had to be defiant.
Okay, so she spoke up for herself. When? When did she do that? Was that when it came to her knowing the Chinese language? As we already saw, Murasaki hid her learning of Chinese when nasty rumors about her were going around, and she pretended not to know it. She feigned stupidity. Where was that brilliant, defiant woman speaking up for herself? How about when she said she wanted to talk back to the woman who said it wasn't appropriate for her to read Chinese books? Murasaki says she wanted to argue with them, but didn't. How did she defiantly speak up for herself? Or more importantly, did she need to? Anita wants us to think so, but we already saw that her father, the prime minister, and even the king of Japan didn't seem to care. So did Murasaki really need to be defiant? I don't think so. Anyway, I'm done for real this time. Thanks for watching and subscribe.